Okay, you've made it this far. Let's finish out strong. This is part two of Russia and the U.S. Let's pull this up. In part one, we were talking, at the end of it, we were talking about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and as NATO expanded closer to Russia, Russia felt threatened. NATO had been the Soviet Union's main adversary. They were enemies for like 50 years. And so they don't like the Russians don't feel comfortable with NATO expanding closer to their borders. In this final video, we're going to have the same essential questions for our unit. We're going to talk about a few final things that the United States and Russia have cooperated on and had conflicts over. So that is what we're going to talk about in this video. A lot of it centers around the man in charge in Russia, and of course, you know his name is Vladimir Putin. Remember, he was a KGB officer, which was the secret spy agency in Russia. He grew up with this distrust of the West and the United States. And when I say the West, I mean Western Europe, like Great Britain and France and Germany and Norway and those countries. So he's got this distrust of the West, and he also has this sense of wanting to bring Russia back to its rightful state of power in the world and its rightful place of earning respect of other countries. So here he is with a smug look on his face. Some things going on. Since 2012, the United States has tried to put a missile defense system in Eastern Europe. This is a system that if a warhead were launched, this defense system could shoot it down. So it could stop a potential nuclear missile. And so we say that we want to protect Europe from Iran if Iran is getting nuclear weapons. But Putin and a lot of people in Russia think that it's actually to defend against a Russian attack. And that's an issue because for 60 years, the United States and Russia have had this balance of power when it comes to nuclear weapons. If we launch theirs, they'll launch. If we launch ours, they'll launch theirs. And so nobody will launch because we would just blow each other up. But if we have a defense system, all of a sudden that means we could attack and we don't have to worry about Russia bombing us. So that's their perspective. They think the missile defense system is a threat to their well-being. So they raised a fuss, and we ended up not putting it there. Another point of conflict is in Syria. There's been a civil war for like 6 years, and Russia has supported the government, and we have supported the rebels. So that's another point of conflict. Another point of conflict has to do with nonprofit organizations. When the Soviet Union fell apart, there weren't a lot of nonprofits doing work in Russia. So things like a food bank, a blood donation system, all kinds of things, animal shelters, all sorts of nonprofits. So we had an organization in Russia helping them set up, and we were spending like $50 million a year in Russia. Putin ends up accusing us of interfering in the Russian election, and he kicks out, the group is called USAID, so he kicks them out of Russia. So those are 3 points of conflict. A fourth point of conflict we've had recently with Russia has to do with a guy named Magnitsky. And he was a lawyer in Russia, and he called out the government for some corruption, that they had stolen his money, like hundreds of millions of dollars. He ends up getting put in jail, and he ends up dying in jail. And a lot of people think there was some foul play, like the Russian government. It was a human rights violation, and maybe they let him die, or they actively avoided giving him medical help that he needed. So after watching that, our Congress passed something called the Magnitsky Act, And anybody in Russia involved in human rights violations, we said they cannot come to our country. So we prohibited them from coming to our country if they had human rights violations. Well, Russia retaliates, and there are quite a few Americans who adopt babies from Russia. And so Russia said that that could no longer happen. We could no longer adopt babies from Russia. So a little tit for tat, a little conflict there. Finally, big deal in 2016. I don't know if you've heard of these two people, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, but they were running against each other for president. There's a lot of evidence that Russia used social media accounts, got onto Twitter and Facebook and things like that, and said a lot of nasty things to people and circulated things that were not true, information that was not true about the candidates. And they think that Russia was doing this, trying to get disinformation just to mess with our democracy and to create division, to make Republicans and Democrats dislike each other even more than they already did. So Russia also, there's evidence that they tried to hack into 39 states' voting systems. So what were they doing? Why was Russia doing it? They wanted to undermine public confidence in democracy, right? They don't really have a democracy. They have, they have elections, but it's kind of more of an autocracy. There's also evidence that they were specifically trying to hurt Hillary Clinton and help elect Donald Trump. And all of this is according to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, reflecting the views of the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and the National Security Agency. So all of our main intelligence operations are accusing Russia of doing these things that were wrong. It's a pretty big deal. It's almost an act of war. I don't know what exactly qualifies something as an act of war, but interfering with another country's elections is a very big deal. Dan Coats, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence in 2018 said, quote, "There should be no doubt that Russia perceives its past efforts as successful and views the 2018 U.S. midterm elections as a potential target for Russian influence operations." So in 2018, there was evidence of more Russian interference, and American intelligence officers have been working really hard to get the election secure for 2020. Hopefully, they will have succeeded. Okay, what about our economies? Our economy in Russia, we're linked a little bit. We do trade with them. We export about $7 billion worth of goods to them. We import about $17 billion from them. That sounds like a lot of money, but our overall trade is $4 trillion. So $7 billion to them is not that much, but it's a little bit. When they wanted to join the World Trade Organization, which is the big organization that oversees and organizes trade around the world, we supported them joining. That was in 2012. We do object. We do have one little conflict with them with the economy. They occasionally sell arms to other countries, and we try to have them not do that. In general, we try to prevent the spread of arms around the country unless we're selling them ourselves. Okay, finally, I've showed you a map earlier about the links between the pipelines from Russia to the rest of the Europe. This shows an oil pipeline and a gas pipeline. The oil is the reddish line. The green pipeline is a natural gas. So you can see Russia is exporting a lot to a lot of countries. And there's a little concern about that with NATO, that if the NATO countries are dependent upon that natural gas, it's used to heat your house mostly, then Russia could manipulate that country. They could raise or lower the prices of the gas, and they could put pressure on the country to do whatever they wanted to do. And they have done that. They did that in the country, the Ukraine. So we know that that's something that Russia thinks that they could use as a weapon if they wanted to. Finally, let's talk about something called the near abroad. The near abroad is the countries that are near Russia but are abroad. They're other countries. And they are these yellow countries here, which are the former Soviet republics. And Russia still wants to have some influence in these countries. They used to have trade networks and communication networks and transportation networks when it was all the Soviet Union. It kind of fell apart, but Russia's trying to reestablish those connections. Sometimes it gets a little testy because some of the countries don't want to reestablish connections with Russia. So this happens in Georgia in 2008, where Russia ends up invading Georgia. And you can see Georgia's a small country. These darker shaded areas, Russia ended up occupying and taking as territory. I think they still occupy those two areas today. Russia claims that there are a lot of people that are ethnically Russians and speak Russians, that there are Russians living in those areas. And that's true. There are a lot of Russians living there. But Georgia nevertheless felt like they were invaded by Russia. By the way, Georgia was trying to join NATO. And so this was a point of tension between the two countries. Another country trying to join up with the West was the Ukraine. They were trying to join the European Union, which is another link to Western Europe. When Ukraine is making these moves to link up, Russia doesn't like it. Russia invades in 2014. They end up taking the Crimean Peninsula, which is down here. It was about 70% of the people who lived there were Russians. So Russia claims they're just taking what's theirs. But that land had been part of the country of Ukraine for 15 years. Anyway, Russia invaded in 2014 and took it. So when we say that Russia's having clashes and doesn't like its former republics moving towards the West, they're actually not just saying they don't like it, they're actually using military force to prevent it from happening. So, where are we today? The U.S. and Russia are at a crossroads. Since 1991, we have cooperated on many issues, but we have also had plenty of conflict. Going forward, what I want you guys to think about is the same thing the leaders of both of these countries are thinking about. We have to acknowledge the importance of the relationship between the two countries, and we have to try to think about how we're going to shape and mold that relationship so that both countries can benefit from the relationship. So think about it. We'll talk about it. And if you have any questions, email me or see me in class.